On the night of 21 August 1930, as later accounts describe severe weather around Glamis Castle in Scotland, a child was born into a family that still stood one step away from the throne. She was born at Glamis Castle. She would grow up beside the crown with all the visibility of monarchy and none of a sovereign's defined purpose. 25 years later, on 31 October 1955, Princess Margaret announced that she wouldn't marry the man she loved. Her statement didn't say, "I have put duty before all else." The words were more formal and more revealing. "Conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth," Margaret declared, "I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." That decision became the hinge of her life. Princess Margaret was constrained by the Crown, the Church of England, cabinet politics, and the expectations placed on a royal woman in 1955. But she also chose to remain inside the world that had formed her. The price of marrying Peter Townsend wasn't, as later legend often claims, the automatic loss of her title, income, home, and royal identity. The real terms were more complicated, more constitutional, and perhaps more painful. She could have married him through a civil ceremony while surrendering her succession rights. A government plan even contemplated preserving her style as HRH Princess Margaret and her civil list income. She didn't take that path. What followed wasn't a simple punishment for one decision. It was a marriage built in the shadow of a lost one, a private refuge on Moustique that became another public trap, and a long decline that ended quietly in a London hospital room. Margaret was neither a romantic martyr nor merely a spoiled princess. She was the spare, trained for importance, denied a governing role, and unable to decide whether freedom was worth becoming less royal. At 9:22 p.m., Princess Margaret Rose of York entered the world at Glamis Castle, the ancestral home of her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. Her father was Prince Albert, Duke of York, the shy second son of King George V. Her mother was the Duchess of York. Neither yet wore a crown. The Home Secretary, J.R. Clines, attended the birth as an official witness, an old safeguard for children near the succession. Margaret weighed 7 pounds. She was the first royal child born in Scotland in more than 300 years. At that moment, she was fourth in line to the throne, behind her uncle, the Prince of Wales, her father, and her elder sister Elizabeth, born in 1926. Then, in December 1936, Edward VIII abdicated. The Duke of York became King George VI. 10-year-old Elizabeth became heir presumptive. Margaret became second in line. Heir presumptive mattered. Under the male preference rules of the time, a future son of George VI would have displaced Elizabeth. But no son came. Elizabeth's future was fixed. Margaret's was altered with it. Later biographers repeated a story that young Margaret told Elizabeth, "Poor you," when she learned her sister would become queen. No contemporary record preserves the exchange, so it can't carry more weight than an anecdote. Yet the story survived because it catches something true about the sisters' positions. Elizabeth inherited duty. Margaret inherited proximity to it. Their childhood had been unusually warm by royal standards. The public saw the York family as a close domestic unit at 145 Piccadilly in London and at Royal Lodge in Windsor. Their father called Elizabeth his pride and Margaret his joy. Margaret was quick, funny, musical, and capable of filling a room. Family photographs show the contrast beginning early. Elizabeth composed, Margaret animated. Marion Crawford, their Scottish governess, known as Crawfie, educated both girls at home. Their lessons included history, religion, languages, art, and music. But the education diverged where monarchy required it to diverge. Elizabeth received specialized instruction in constitutional history and law from Henry Martin of Eton and from the Archbishop of Canterbury. Margaret didn't. She learned piano from childhood and became an accomplished player and singer. During the Second World War, while the sisters lived largely at Windsor Castle, Margaret performed in amateur theatricals and pantomimes. She sang show tunes. She acted. She developed the appetite for artistic company, theater, music, and design that would remain with her for life. Those weren't trivial accomplishments. Margaret later became the first president of the Royal Ballet in 1957. She held connections with Sadler's Wells, Scottish Ballet, Birmingham Royal Ballet, nursing organizations, children's charities, hospitals, Girl Guiding, and St. John Ambulance. Sources list more than 80 patronages and presidencies. In 1948 alone, while Elizabeth was occupied by pregnancy and early motherhood, Margaret reportedly carried out 35 official engagements. She represented the crown overseas, including at Jamaica's independence celebrations in 1962. She supported children's welfare charities and, much later, lent quiet support to AIDS-related work through the London Lighthouse. Her problem wasn't that she had nothing to do. Her problem was that none of these duties answered the question of what she was for. A sovereign has a constitutional role. A future sovereign is prepared for one. The spare is prepared to appear, to comfort, to open, to inspect, to represent, to entertain. Margaret's public life required discipline, charm, and stamina, but it didn't offer the singular purpose that had been built into Elizabeth's life from 1936 onward. That distinction became sharper after King George VI died on 6 February 1952. Elizabeth became queen at 25. Margaret was 21. The crown had moved from their father to her sister. Margaret remained close enough to the center to be watched, but without authority of her own. The press had already begun to make a character out of her. She was photographed at balls, nightclubs, charity performances, theater premieres, and formal receptions. Her friends became known as the Margaret set. The newspapers tracked every aristocrat, prince, and wealthy bachelor who stood near her long enough to trigger an engagement rumor. In 1950, Marion Crawford published The Little Princesses, an unauthorized memoir about the royal sisters' childhood. The royal household was horrified. Crawford was effectively cut off from the family she had served. Her book helped establish an early public image of Margaret as the lively, difficult, indulged younger princess. That image would become useful to the press. It would also become a trap. Peter Townsend didn't enter Margaret's life as a fashionable bachelor. He arrived as a decorated RAF officer and Battle of Britain veteran. Townsend had joined the Royal Air Force at 19. During the Second World War, he became a fighter pilot and was awarded the Distinguished Service Order and Distinguished Flying Cross. In 1944, he was appointed equerry to King George VI, a military officer attached to the royal household. He wasn't Margaret's personal equerry, but the role placed him inside the family's daily orbit. He accompanied the royal family on the 1947 South African tour. Margaret was 17. Townsend was 32, married to Rosemary Townsend, and the father of 2 sons. Their mature relationship appears to have developed later, after the king's death and after the collapse of Townsend's marriage. In August 1952, he became comptroller of the Queen Mother's household. Margaret lived within that household at Clarence House. Their proximity increased. Townsend's divorce from Rosemary was completed in late 1952 or early 1953, depending on the source used. The timing mattered. So did the fact that Rosemary was alive. On 2nd of June 1953, Westminster Abbey was packed for Elizabeth II's coronation. Margaret was 22. Townsend was there in uniform. Accounts consistently report that Margaret reached over and brushed a piece of lint or fluff from his tunic. No single famous frame settles every detail of the moment, but it was observed and widely repeated. The gesture was small enough to be deniable, intimate enough to be understood. A princess touching a senior courtier's uniform at her sister's coronation became a national clue. The British press had a story. The royal household had a crisis. Townsend was posted to Brussels as heir attaché. The transfer separated him from Margaret, while she remained under the age of 25. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, descendants of George II needed the sovereign's consent to marry. Any marriage contracted without that consent was void. For Margaret, the law had a second route. Once she reached 25, a royal whose request for consent had been refused could notify the Privy Council of an intended marriage. After 12 calendar months, the marriage could proceed unless both Houses of Parliament formally disapproved. Margaret turned 25 on the 21st of August, 1955. That didn't make her free in the ordinary sense. It gave her access to a legal mechanism that had never been used by a member of the royal family. Church doctrine imposed a separate obstacle. In 1955, the Church of England didn't permit its marriage service for a divorced person whose former spouse was still living. Townsend's former wife was alive. A church wedding was unavailable. This mattered beyond personal belief. Elizabeth II was Supreme Governor of the Church of England. A marriage between her sister and a divorced man wouldn't simply be a family dispute. It would touch the church, the government, Parliament, the Commonwealth realms, the line of succession, and the public prestige of a monarchy still recovering from Edward VIII's abdication less than 20 years earlier. Townsend returned from Brussels in October 1955. The press descended. He later recalled spending 19 painful days in a borrowed London flat while between 50 and 100 reporters waited outside. The conventional story says Margaret was forbidden to marry him. The documents tell a harder story. Cabinet papers released after Margaret's death showed that Prime Minister Anthony Eden's government considered an arrangement that would have allowed a civil marriage. Under the proposed accommodation, Margaret and any children of the marriage would surrender rights of succession. She wouldn't have had an Anglican wedding, yet she could have retained her style as HRH Princess Margaret, her £6,000 civil list allowance, an additional allowance connected with marriage, residence in Britain, and possibly public duties if political opinion accepted them. The Royal Marriages Act itself didn't require automatic loss of title, income, housing, or royal status. Its direct sanction was the invalidity of an unauthorized marriage, so the choice was real, but it wasn't simple. Margaret could marry Peter Townsend in a civil ceremony. She would have to renounce her succession rights. She would have to reject the Church of England's teaching on the indissolubility of Christian marriage. She would become the sister of the sovereign who had publicly defied the institution the sovereign led. Every part of the arrangement would have been negotiated in public. The proposal involved cabinet ministers, Commonwealth governments, constitutional precedent, and Parliament. It was an exit route, but it wasn't a quiet door. On 31st October 1955, Clarence House released Margaret's statement. The BBC interrupted normal programming to broadcast it. "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend," she began. Then came the sentence that changes the whole story. "I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage." Margaret directly acknowledged that a path existed, but mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, she continued, "and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." She ended by saying she had reached the decision entirely alone, strengthened by Townsend's unfailing support and devotion. The statement didn't read like a woman casually choosing a title over a lover. It didn't read like a woman with no choice. It read like the language of monarchy, compressed, formal, and built to make an institutional decision sound private. There is no reliable evidence that Margaret merely signed words drafted entirely by others. Later accounts indicate that she and Townsend worked on the wording, and that Margaret resisted removing the word devotion. The final text remains her public position, whatever private pressure surrounded it. Her claim that she acted entirely alone can't tell us how alone she felt. No surviving record can measure the force of family pressure in a palace, or the weight of becoming the divorced wife of a man once employed by her father. No document can reconstruct the final private conversation between Margaret and Townsend, and none should be invented. What the record can establish is this. By 31 October 1955, Margaret had chosen not to renounce succession rights and not to enter a civil marriage outside the church's teaching. Townsend returned to Belgium. In December 1959, he married Marie-Luce Germania, a Belgian woman. The relationship's loss mattered to Margaret. That much is clear from its place in every serious account of her life. But it can't explain everything that followed. It didn't mechanically create the failures of her marriage, the bitterness of her later relationships, or her declining health. It did, however, leave her in the royal life she had refused to relinquish. 5 years later, she married Anthony Armstrong Jones. Armstrong Jones was a photographer, not an aristocrat. He was intelligent, socially agile, visually sophisticated, and deeply at ease among artists, writers, actors, designers, and fashionable London society. Margaret met him in 1958 at a gathering hosted by Lady Elizabeth Cavendish. Their courtship was conducted largely in secret. Widcombe Manor, home to Jeremy and Camilla Fry, became one of the places where they could meet away from the press. He proposed in October 1959. The engagement was publicly announced on 26 February 1960. On Friday, May 6, 1960, Margaret entered Westminster Abbey in a Norman Hartnell silk organza gown and the Poltimore tiara. Her father had been dead for 8 years, so Prince Philip escorted her and gave her away. 2,000 guests filled the Abbey. An estimated 20 million viewers watched in Britain. Broadcasts reached an estimated 300 million people worldwide. It was the first British royal wedding to be televised. The spectacle had a public meaning beyond one marriage. Margaret had been denied the wedding the public expected her to have with Townsend. Now she had a photographer husband, a spectacular dress, television cameras, and an audience measured in hundreds of millions. The wedding appeared to solve the old crisis. It made Margaret modern without making her leave the monarchy. Armstrong Jones brought artistic glamour into a family still associated with uniforms, country houses, and inherited restraint. In 1961, their son David was born. In 1964, their daughter Sarah followed. Armstrong Jones became Earl of Snowdon in 1961. Margaret became Countess of Snowdon. But the fairy tale image didn't describe the marriage that developed behind it. Their temperaments were mismatched. Margaret had been raised in an environment where rank organized every room. Snowdon had made a life among artists and social climbers, where charm, talent, humor, and access could matter more than precedence. He had married into the institution that made Margaret who she was. She had married a man whose world offered an escape from it. Neither could entirely live in the other's world. Accounts from biographers and people around the couple describe a marriage marked by incompatibility, separation, and affairs on both sides. Snowdon had fathered a daughter, Polly Fry, with Camilla Fry before the wedding. The child was born during the Snowdons' honeymoon period. Margaret's relationships with Anthony Barton, Robin Douglas Home, and later Roddy Llewellyn have been widely reported with varying degrees of documentary support. The broad conclusion is secure. Their marriage wasn't undone by one affair or one photograph. It deteriorated over years. The most lurid anecdotes about their cruelty require caution. Stories circulate of handwritten notes supposedly headed, "Things I Hate About You," placed in drawers, diaries, and even the pocket of Margaret's coat as she dressed. The available evidence does not establish those specific notes with enough certainty to present them as fact. No surviving list has become the proof object people wish it to be. Yet the absence of a verified hate list does not turn the marriage into a misunderstanding. The separation was public by 19th of March, 1976, when Kensington Palace announced it. A decree nisi followed in May 1978. The decree absolute came in July 1978. Their divorce was frequently described as the first divorce of a senior royal since the Tudor era. The comparison makes a good headline, but it says little about why their marriage failed. Margaret and Snowdon weren't the outcome of a 16th century constitutional drama. They were two people in a marriage that turned into a contest of resentments, infidelities, incompatible social worlds, and mutual injuries. The Crown had not chosen Snowdon for Margaret, but it had created the conditions in which a royal woman who couldn't bear to leave monarchy might seek freedom through a man who was fascinated by its glamour and impatient with its rules. By the early 1960s, Margaret had another answer to the confinement of palace life. It was an island in the Grenadines. Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner, bought Mustique in 1958. Around Margaret's 1960 wedding and honeymoon, he gave her a 10-acre plot there as a wedding gift. On it, Margaret built Les Jolies Eaux, French for beautiful waters. The villa was designed by theatrical designer Oliver Messel and completed around 1972. It stood at Geliseau Point on Mustique's southern end, looking out across the sea. The house had 5 bedrooms, open spaces, and the theatrical confidence of a place built for sun, parties, privacy, and a different version of life. Lady Anne Glenconner, Margaret's friend and lady-in-waiting, later called Les Jolies Eaux the only house she ever owned, and said it gave Margaret an independent base from her husband. That distinction mattered. Kensington Palace was a royal residence. Clarence House was a royal residence. Balmoral, Sandringham, Buckingham Palace, Windsor, each belonged to the system. Les Jolies Eaux was a property Margaret could call hers. 10 acres, 1 house, a place where she could choose the guest list. Mustique didn't free her from privilege, it was made possible by privilege. But it offered an unusual condition in Margaret's life. She came first. By 1973, she had met Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years younger than she was. Their relationship reportedly lasted about 8 years. Then Mustique turned against them. On 22nd of February 1976, the News of the World published photographs of Margaret and Llewellyn in swimwear on the island. The images made their relationship impossible to contain. A private beach became a tabloid front page. The princess, who had been watched in Westminster Abbey, at charity galas, and from palace balconies, was photographed in the one place designed to evade all of that. The pictures didn't create the Snowdons' broken marriage. Their separation was announced less than a month later, on 19 March, but the relationship had already been damaged by years of incompatibility and affairs. What the photographs did was destroy the remaining public fiction. The British public had accepted Margaret's 1960 wedding as a glamorous recovery from the Townsend crisis. In 1976, the Mustique photograph supplied the opposite image, a princess in swimwear with a younger lover, exposed not in a ballroom or an abbey, but in the private world she had built for herself. Les Jolies Eaux had been an independent base. It was also vulnerable to a long lens. That pattern runs through Margaret's life. The institution gave her beauty, position, money, staff, residences, access, travel, and a public platform for causes she cared about. It also gave every private decision a national audience. She couldn't live normally because she was royal. She wouldn't stop being royal because normal life required it. The consequences weren't borne by Margaret alone. She was known to be difficult. Some people around her felt affection and loyalty. Others remembered demands, sharpness, and entitlement. The evidence does not support a clean staff verdict that she was sad, not monster. and it shouldn't be turned into a quotation. But the surviving portrait does contain both elements. She could command loyalty over decades. She could also make life harder for those whose employment gave them limited power to answer back. That is where sympathy has to keep its steel. Margaret's loneliness, public scrutiny, and lack of a constitutional role may help explain the anger people encountered. They don't excuse cruelty toward staff, relatives, or anyone trapped in the room with her rank. At the same time, a catalog of bad manners can't contain her life. Margaret was a serious patron of ballet. She supported hospitals, nursing services, children's welfare organizations, youth groups, and cultural institutions. She performed public duties for more than 5 decades. She had musical ability that friends remembered with admiration. In December 1957, the University of London awarded her an honorary Doctor of Music degree. Her public work didn't erase the scandals. The scandals didn't erase the work. The same tension appeared in her relationship with Elizabeth II. The sisters' roles had been divided when they were children. Elizabeth became the sovereign who had to make the monarchy endure. Margaret became the sister whose emotional life could become news. Elizabeth couldn't publicly solve Margaret's problems without creating constitutional problems of her own. Margaret couldn't entirely separate her unhappiness from the sister who represented the institution she had chosen to preserve. They remained connected throughout their lives. Their bond was neither the simple warmth of childhood portraits nor the cold rivalry sometimes imagined by later dramatizations. It was a relationship between two women who loved one another and lived inside radically different obligations. Elizabeth had the crown. Margaret had the burden of being near it. By the late 1990s, Margaret's health was deteriorating. She had smoked heavily for much of her adult life. Her later condition involved multiple strokes, mobility loss, and cardiac complications. In 1998, she suffered a mild stroke. In 1999, she sustained serious burns to her feet and legs after entering an excessively hot bath at Les Jolies Eaux. More strokes at Christmas 2000 and in March 2001 left her partially paralyzed and using a wheelchair. The woman once photographed dancing through London society, appearing in tiaras at state occasions, and reclining on a Caribbean beach became increasingly confined by illness. On 8 February 2002, Margaret suffered another stroke. Cardiac complications followed. At 6:30 a.m. on 9 February 2002, Princess Margaret died in her sleep at King Edward VII's Hospital in London. She was 71. Her death came just before dawn, without the spectacle that had accompanied so much of her public life. 6 days later, on 15 February, her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. She was cremated, and her ashes were later placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel beside her parents. So, did Princess Margaret destroy her own happiness by choosing the crown over Peter Townsend? Or did the institution leave her no livable alternative? Both truths stand. She wasn't absolutely forbidden from marrying Townsend after she turned 25. Her own statement acknowledged that a civil marriage was possible if she renounced succession rights. Cabinet planning suggested that she might have retained her HRH style and civil list income. But the available route required her to become a public constitutional problem, reject an Anglican ceremony, surrender her place in the succession, and step away from the role that had defined her since childhood. She didn't pay that price. The crown, the church, cabinet, family history, and public expectation made the price cruelly high. But Margaret chose the royal identity that had narrowed her options. She remained Princess Margaret, and that decision continued to shape the world in which she lived. The Snowdon marriage didn't have to fail because Townsend had been lost. Its failure had its own causes: mismatch, resentment, infidelity, and mutual damage. Mystique didn't cause the marriage's collapse either. It gave Margaret a rare piece of territory where she owned the house, chose the atmosphere, and could briefly come first. Then the photographs made even that refuge public property. The enduring image isn't the lint brushed from a uniform at the 1953 coronation. It isn't the 1955 statement, the Poltimore tiara, the Mustique beach photographs, or the hospital room alone. It's Margaret moving through all of them. A gifted pianist, an arts patron, a mother, a difficult employer, a glamorous royal, a woman capable of loyalty and injury, and the younger sister who spent her life close to the throne without ever possessing its purpose. At 6:30 on the morning of 9 February 2002, the princess who had never been free of the headlines died in her sleep at King Edward VII's hospital.